obviously Marlene and I are out on location again. They've let us out. And here we are in beautiful sunny Milngavie, and we're in the middle of the high street. We've actually perched ourselves on the end of a pensioners for Indie stall, which they have every week. And we just wanted to introduce this month's Indie Jigsaw show, which is going to be on the topic of constitutions.
Really looking forward to this episode going out. Did an interview with Mike Russell. I thought it was really interesting.
It was very interesting, and although there's a lot of work being done by various people to try and get constitutions moving, this is the one that sounds to me as if it's got the most chance of being officially accepted, and to have the Scottish Government feel that they can take part, take it forward.
So don't miss that one. Tune in for that. And although it is Mike who's set it going, but it's not in and of itself an SNP initiative. There's groups all over the S movement involved, including pensioners.
Yeah. And including yourself. Marlene is helping design our new country.
But it's just exciting. I mean, whatever little ideas you might be in a position to feed in, and a constitution. Remember we came across that definition, really nice little definition. A constitution it's about what a country stands for, but it's also about what a country doesn't stand for.
We'll be returning to Milngavie later on, but for now we're back in the studio, and Marlene is about to introduce our very special guest.
I was really pleased that we managed to get this interview. It's with Mike Russell. So for people who are trying to remember what jobs he did in the Scottish Parliament, I mean, his last job was as Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. Before that, he was a Cabinet Secretary for Constitutional Relations. But it was great talking to Mike, and we just happened to find ourselves chatting to him up in Arbroath, didn't we?
We did. We just bumped into him on his way off the stage after he'd given his address at the rally, and he was very generously agreed to come and be interviewed by us, which was lovely.
So Mike was there on the march, and of course he gave that speech at the rally afterwards. If anyone wants to see that whole speech, you can find it on our Indie Live Extra channel on YouTube. But for the moment, let's go to the interview that we did with Mike, and then after that we'll have a little chat about it. So welcome everyone, it's another edition of the Indie Jigsaw Show, and the theme for this month's edition is the Constitution, a possible constitution for an independent Scotland. I'm sitting here, as it were, with Mike Russell, President of the SNP, but of course also been an MSP in Holyrood for a great many years. Could we start to begin with and just put it in the perspective of where things are now? Because, we're in the UK, it doesn't have a written constitution.
It's very odd that we live in a country without essentially a codified constitution. There are bits of written constitutions. You could say that the Scotland Act is a bit of a written constitution, but of course this is all subsumed in this 18th and 19th century idea of Westminster sovereignty, that whatever happens, Westminster is in charge and cannot ever be gainsaid by anybody, and that devolution is essentially a delicate dance around that concept of Westminster sovereignty. So that creates an unreality. If any parliament believes it is so important and so mighty that it cannot be gainsaid, and indeed now it doesn't even look as if a prime minister has to answer to anybody but himself. In all those circumstances, we need to step away from that and to say what would reasonable citizens expect in the country in which they live, not subjects, but reasonable citizens expect in the 21st century in the country in which they live. So there is a crying demand, a need for a written codified constitution that we all know where we stand. And not only, and that will bring us on to the issue of a transitional constitution, not only where we stand and are going to stand, but how we get from one to the other, because the process of independence is extremely important. I absolutely buy into the idea that in 2023 people will have the chance, we hope, to vote, and I buy into the idea that I want them to vote for that. But then, voting for it, we have to make it happen. And that means taking the will of the people and converting that into a set of arrangements that allows Scotland to become independent and to join the world. And to a great extent, that's what a transitional constitution is about. It's not about the final outcome. It's not about how you and I might want to see Scotland as an independent country, and we can certainly talk about that. And, we all got ideas, and I think very radical ideas. It's how we get from A to B, and it's how we offer the reassurance to those people who did not support it, that process can take place in an orderly fashion. And that's what we're engaged in at the moment.
Yeah. So do you want to say a bit about how you've been going about that?
I have to say I've come slightly late to it. There have been various attempts at constitutions. The great Neil McCormack, of course, had more than a passing acquaintanceship with this issue and drafted a constitution. Others have attempted to draft constitutions, but they've all been on the basis, this is how we want Scotland to look when we are independent. I was sceptical about the issue of being engaged in that now. When I was Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, it seemed to me that we had to essentially get independence, or get people to vote for independence before we did anything else. But I got persuaded in two ways, and I might have been wrong about that and was wrong about that. One was by Elliot Bulmer, who is a constitutional specialist and lawyer, and somebody who has been involved in drafting constitutions and is still involved in drafting constitutions as an academic and an expert. And the other really was the experience of talking to people across the Yes movement who wanted something that would provide the framework for us to work together after a Yes vote to get to that moment of independence and beyond it. So last year, when Nicola had asked me to provide some political direction to some of these issues within the party, I approached a number of Yes organisations, not all SNP by any manner of means, and said, how about working together to see if we could get that transitional constitution, on the grounds that if the wider Yes movement bought into it, then it had a chance of succeeding and providing something that was useful. And once that had been agreed and we'd had that conversation and people had come on board, a range of organisations had come on board, then we commissioned Elliot Bulmer to write a draft. That happened. The draft exists. It is being looked at by those organisations. And I hope that shortly, and everything takes time, I hope that shortly we'll have a second draft, and then we can begin to consult on that. Now, we can't consult in the way that the government consults. I mean, that's beyond us. But we can consult about what this should look like. Now, in the process of doing this, some people have seemed to have got the wrong end of the stick and have been waving it quite vigorously. This is not a finished constitution. Yeah. This is not it. There are things that won't be in that because they haven't been agreed. And we'll come to that in a moment. Things like the monarchy and things like that, which we can have opinions on, but we're not actually in a position to say this is what's going to happen in a transitional constitution. But it should provide the reassurance and the framework to allow us to become independent. And it doesn't have to be anodyne. There are things in it that are really important. For example, a single chamber parliament and no House of Lords is an obvious thing. And therefore, if there's no House of Lords, there's no room for titles and such things. So those just go, because they go with the current constitutional structures. So that's the work's being done. I hope at some stage this year we'll have a second draft. We will be able to talk about that second draft. And then if that can get agreed, or reasonably widely agreed, then I think it's up to the Scottish Government as we move forward, because in the event of a yes vote, which I very much hope will take place, that's when you start to bring this in, you start to get it in place for a date at which it becomes effective. And what we have now stops being so, and we move to that transitional constitution, and we make a commitment. Really, final point, sorry to go on too long with this, but it's really important. At that point, we have to set a date and a procedure to have the final constitution, and that the transitional constitution will mandate that. Now, my own position, the SNP position on this, is that there should be a type of citizens' assembly. The people of Scotland should be involved, including those who did not vote for independence, in deciding what that final constitution is. I was involved in setting up the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland, the one we had 2 years ago. I very much believe that that's the right way to do it. So I want the transitional constitution to mandate a period of time in which that has to take place and how it will take place. If you leave it too long, then that's not good.
Yeah. So maybe at this point I should probably say, but in the interest of transparency, kind of say that I'm one of the people who's involved in this consultative group that Mike set up. That I'm there on behalf of Pensioners for Independence. Myself and my colleague from Pensioners for Independence, we were very pleased to be asked, and then you emailed us the draft version of it, and I have to say I kind of wilted. I thought, wow, it's I mean, how many pages? And it's over 50 pages.
Yeah.
It's over 50 pages. So for anyone watching, I'll just say this to you: it takes quite a lot of determination to go through those 50 pages with a bit of a fine-tooth comb, because that's what you asked us. You asked all the groups to do: read it, send back comments, any additions, things we thought could be better, and a lot of it seemed to me to be absolutely essential that sort of thing was in a constitution, worthy but sort of boring.
Absolutely, you've got to have it.
Yeah, you've got to have it.
The reason it's taken a bit of time too is because it's not just Pensioners for India, we're commenting, there was a whole range of bodies, and all that stuff had to be collated. Now, I think Elliot has almost finished that task, and I hope we'll be able to move on after the local elections to begin to work on that. But yes, I mean, there are things in it which, you would have to be a constitutional obsessive to find that interesting. There are other really important things in it. I mean, many of us would want to see something done about the issue of land ownership. But the question of whether you can put that into a transitional constitution or whether that becomes an issue for a final constitution is a moot point.
Yeah.
I don't know is the answer to that. And out of the next round of this discussion, I think we're going to resolve that and find a way to resolve it.
Yes. That hopefully that would be the case. So just to be clear about what might happen. So Elliot's going to be looking through all our comments and coming up with a version 2. At some point there'll be more discussion, but at some point, if I'm correct, then your intention is to put that to the Scottish Government and ask it to be put to Holyrood.
Yeah, the next stage in this is where the organisations involved will come back together. They've already given their submissions. It took, as ever, longer than we had hoped. Some people were slow, some people lost it, some people forgot. But anyway, there it is. It's there. I hope, as I say, after the local election, some stage we'll sit down, I hope face to face for the first time, as it's all been done virtually so far. We'll come to a conclusion of what the second draft looks like. We'll then ask the organisations to talk about that second draft to their members and to see what their members think, to widen the pool out a bit. And then we'll get, we hope, to a final draft. Now, that final draft, I'm then open to what we do, but my own view is that we should publish that final draft at that stage. I mean, there's no point in publishing it now because there's so much detail in it.
Yeah.
We'll publish that final draft and we'll give it to the Scottish Government and we'll say, that's been arranged and agreed by these bodies, and in this way, we hope that is an important contribution to the development of a transitional constitution. Now, in 2014, towards the very end of the campaign, the Scottish Government did publish a sort of draft constitution, but I think everybody would accept it was a bit of an afterthought. I hope this time things will be much, much more better prepared, and you have seen even the first draft. I think that document does contain what we need in order to move from A to B. But there's also another point, is the point of reassurance. If you have people who find this process worrying, who are against this process or against independence, we have to say to them, look, your rights are guaranteed and absolutely guaranteed. The rights and privileges that you have now will be guaranteed. Privileges is a loose word. I'm not talking about being a member of the House of Lords, but the things you have as a citizen, you will continue to have. And there are examples in other places where that process has not necessarily protected those who were against change, and therefore we have to be able to provide that protection and reassurance. So the Constitution has to provide that too. It has to provide a defence for individual citizens.
Yeah, so does that mean then that final version, or final as far as our group is concerned, that will have been maybe put to the Scottish Government, does that mean that then that would be, well, in a way, part and parcel of the the IndyRef to campaign when it happens? Because people would need to know, but people could know in advance, well, okay, I might not be in favour of this, but at least I know, my human rights are safe, or,
yes. That is important, but also I think we have to say to people, look, I think, my view is that the coming independence referendum will be different from the last one. And one of the reasons it'll be different is because we've got far more people involved and far more organizations involved and far more versions of what we all want to see. So we're going to have to accept difference of opinion, and perhaps in 2014 we didn't do enough of that. So what the Constitution also is a shared space where we're guaranteeing things and protections to people, although they have different visions. And we're saying to them, once we are independent, then we can contend for the final version, but also contend for government. And government itself will change that. You could, I think it's highly unlikely, but you could elect a government in Scotland that didn't want to change land ownership, and that would be legitimate. I mean, I wouldn't support it, and I'd do my best not to make sure it wasn't elected, but that would be legitimate. So we also have to, in our minds, be clear that there are those things that are embedded in the Constitution, and there are those things that are a matter of government. And that's also a process we need to go through.
Yes, indeed. And in the, I think it's in the preliminaries to the draft that Elliot's done. He talks about it being a defensive document. Yes. That's not rocking the boat sort of document.
Well, the word defensive, I think, is used in a very legalistic sort of word there. It allows essentially to defend individuals. I'm not sure it doesn't rock the boat. I mean, I think the very idea of a written constitution rocks the UK boat and should rock the UK boat.
Yeah.
I think what it is there are some issues. Let's touch on the most difficult of them, which is the issue of the head of state. There are some issues which, I don't believe can be resolved in a transitional constitution, but they can be resolved in a final constitution. I've always taken the view that it is important we get to independence before we start bashing each other over the head about who's going to be the head of state or stuff. But I'm not in any sense worried about it, because I can live very happily with the idea which we have a Scottish Republic. And that's just as easy for me to accept as a limited constitutional monarchy. I don't have any strong feelings about it, but I don't think we'll resolve it at this stage. Now, we might be able to, but I think it's more likely that we will resolve it at a future stage in a final constitutional process. And therefore, what this needs to do is to provide an improvement, a modernization on it. And the Constitution does make some changes to it, but it has not produced a final answer to that question. And of course, the SNP position has always been the Queen would remain as the head of state, or the monarch would remain as head of state, as long as the Scottish people wanted them. But there would be a mechanism by which they could say they didn't want that to continue. And I think that is probably the right way to handle it at the moment.
Yes. So going back then to, although I must admit I found some of it hard going to focus on and read through, and I could see things were essential, but maybe a bit boring. But that's not true of everything that's even in this draft. There are some parts to it that are quite aspirational, aren't there? So obviously, Elliot Bulmer thinks that that's okay to put in what's even just a provisional document. But what it struck me was that those bits that are a bit more aspirational, they're actually kind of what engage you emotionally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's a drafting issue to be dealt with here too. It's quite difficult sometimes to make legal drafting exciting and inspirational. But there should be things in that constitutional, particularly a preamble, that should be exciting and inspirational. And we're still to do that, and we've still to make sure that happens. I mean, this is a process that isn't even halfway through yet, so that is to happen. I don't think it should be boring. I think it should be exciting, but equally, I don't think we should oversell it on the basis of this is the final word that we're going to have about everything, because we could get ourselves bogged down in an awful lot of debate and discussion and get nowhere. Whereas if we provide the reassurance and the vehicle, you could understand this as a vehicle that's going to take us the next step. There's a campaign, people vote for independence. The vehicle sets off, when we get to the day of independence, it is on the road, and it takes people through to the setting of the final constitution. And that final constitution, there's also mechanisms by which a final constitution could be changed, but they have to be pretty rigorous mechanisms. In the case of Ireland, there's a constitutional requirement for a referendum in these circumstances.
Yeah.
There's usually quite a heavy legislative bar, that you would have to have a pretty high bar before you could change the constitution, the final constitution.
Yes, and I mean that's just a good thing, isn't it? I mean, constitutions are not fail-safe. I mean, they can be tampered with. You see it in certain other countries. That's kind of happening or happened in the past, and hopefully we'd hope that wouldn't happen in Scotland. But obviously, it needs to be a pretty high bar to change things. I mean, one of the first things that came to my mind when we got the invite from you to join in this discussion was a sort of sense of this could be something that could really engage people, really kind of bring people together, but also create an even more of a sense of the country we belong to, the kind of nation that we want. Like what the country stands for, what it doesn't stand for, and I find that really, really exciting. Actually, I find it very moving. Actually,
no, absolutely. A constitution shouldn't be dry, and a constitution is an expression of who we think we are and where we stand in the world. And essentially we should be aspirational and positive and inclusive about that. Now, I just don't think we would probably can do it all at once.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we need to engage all our fellow citizens in, and that is best done after independence. But how do we get to that moment? And can we start it off? And I mean, I think the transitional constitution can also be inspirational. But yes, it's exciting because it's a definition of who we are. And it's also something we can rely on as citizens. I mean, one of the really difficult things, in the current UK setup is you can't really rely on anything. There's a hodgepodge of things that you could sort of think about, but there's nothing that you can pick up and open up and say, that is what guarantees me. That is what guarantees me, And people go around, in America, and they have constitutional problems with the Constitution. They have the Constitution there, and I think now there's also an example there of how sometimes things get out of date, set in stone, but have people become constitutionalists. They believe absolutely, and then you get other constitutions that are not observed. You can think of countries which have elaborate defences for citizens which are simply ignored. So the constitution has to be alive, and it has to be relevant, and has to be actively used. So that we want to make sure we have a document that can do that.
I was thinking about America when I was thinking, the Second Amendment about the right to bear arms, which you could understand why it was in there at the time, but now it's just used as a absolute set in stone excuse for not being able to have proper controls on gun laws.
People get fixated with some things. I mean, it is human nature to become fixated with things, and they get fixated with an element in it, and we have to guard against that. So we have to be very careful in what we write down and how we write it down and how it gets enacted. One of the things that helped to change my mind was a tremendous book about constitution making that came out, I think, 2 years ago, which really turned on its head all the expectations you had and pointed out that some constitutions had been very regressive, very narrow things that actually damaged countries. So we need to be aware and conscious of all that too. And also in the 19th century, the great era of constitution making, where people made constitutions at the drop of a hat. That's now unusual for that to happen. So but we've got huge examples in front of us, and so much history that we know about, that we can, I hope, get this right.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, I found it interesting. Like recently, it's around the various yes groups meetings and kind of what have you, and every now and again you get someone, they're talking about referring back to often a very old historical document, and then, so it might be the Declaration of Arbroath, but there are other ones that are a bit more modern than that, but still quite old. So referring back to historical documents with the notion that, well, let's base our constitution on what's in those. Now, I sympathise with that. Again, I sympathise with that emotionally, especially the one about the Declaration of Arbroath. but we need a new constitution for a new country. So is it really,
Yes,
to what extent is it feasible to do that?
No, you said quite rightly, I think there are 50 pages in this one. Life is complicated, and it's more complicated than it was. And we must also be, fairly rigorous in our scholarship about what these old documents say. I mean, I on an emotional level, I'm happy to accept that the Declaration of Arbroath influenced the American Declaration of Independence. There is a fairly lively debate as to whether that was the case or not. And in actual fact, people will look at the claim of right and say probably more likely to have influenced it. So, I mean, the idea within the Declaration of Arbroath, although that also takes a little bit of pinch of salt with that, there was essentially a contracted kingship. And if somebody let you down, you got rid of them and you got somebody else, it's an absolutely right, is a good idea that has stood the test of time. But, I mean, there are other things and there are ways of expressing. You think, yeah, it's really interesting, but it's not actually relevant to where we are now. Yeah. I think you've got to bring an element of skepticism to this, but also an element of making sure that what we do is thought through carefully and is relevant now, but not so relevant now that it either becomes out of date or is a barrier to things happening. An example would be the place of an electoral commission. A modern constitution should tell you how your elections are held and should provide the framework to make sure that that happens in a free and fair manner. And therefore you will need, in modern times, you will likely have an electoral commission, which is an independent body which supervises those elections. And that does not exist in the Declaration of Arbroath, partly because there are no elections.
Coming to where we actually are now, obviously a very different place from 700 years ago, but where we actually are now. So do you think that maybe there should be some safeguards in place, even within this provisional document, just to safeguard against possibilities that might happen to rock, the first, probably the first few years, first 2 or 3 years of Scotland being independent. I mean, I'm thinking of things like property ownership. If there was a sudden rush by property developers snapping up property, whether it's land or whether it's whether it's buildings, land and who can buy it.
In those circumstances, you have to differentiate between what is in the Constitution and what is a political position held by political parties. So, the constitutional issue there is how much land should individuals be able to own? And are there special circumstances and some places, perhaps, where even those provisions need to be looked at critically? Then there's a political issue of whether or not you want, holiday homes to exist. And you have to be careful not to conflate the two, because it's far too easy to say the constitutional position is that we should never have holiday homes. That's clearly not true. That's legislating against holidays. But there are circumstances, and they've been discussed before, discussed when the Land Commission was established. Is there a limit to how much land people should own? Should there be a ceiling to that? Should people be able to buy a percentage of things? Now, I believe that there probably should be. And I think that is a debate that we continue to have in Scotland. There's also the question of if somebody does own a large bit of land, what are the rights of the people who live on that land? And can those ever be taken away? And now that's actually largely land legislation, but there may be rights in terms of how people live in a community that needs to be enshrined in the Constitution. Now, we need a lot of thinking about this. I mean, I go back to what you said about it's a complicated document. The more you read it, the more you think about how what is appropriate for a constitution and what is appropriate for legislation and political debate. And then to make it further complicated, what's appropriate for a transitional constitution and what's appropriate for a final constitution. So we have all those debates to have, and we need to have them carefully and thoughtfully, and sometimes not in the political atmosphere of the present time, where if you say something, you're likely to be jumped on by 27 people on Twitter. So we need to watch out for that too.
Yes, indeed. And that just brought to mind that actually it was on Twitter. It was just the other day. It was a tweet that Elliot Bulmer had put out, and the main point of the tweet was something else. But he mentioned that he mentioned one of his own books, which is called "Constitution for the Common Good," and I just saw the title of that and thought, that hits the spot, doesn't it? I mean, if you've got a constitution and the one that we end up, provisional one to begin with, and then a final one, and people can look at it in Scotland and go, okay, well, maybe don't agree with everything in that, but they can see that it is a document that's attempting to do that. That would be quite an accomplishment to have brought about. I'm
really keen that bodies and individuals and bodies that are involved in this come to it with a spirit of goodwill, not in a partisan fashion, but and so far so good. As you know, there's been a couple of meetings we've had. A couple of them, people have been a bit doubtful as to whether it started off, doubtful whether this was the right thing to do. I think also contributes to a sense that we are all working together on something important. The Independence Project is an important project. We need to find a way to work together on that, despite our differences. And our movement has been a bit rocky at times in recent times, because sometimes that's not been the case. And I keep saying when I'm at things and where I'm at things, like the rally in Arbroath a couple of weeks ago, there's much more that unites us and divides us. Yeah. If we can work practically on things together, then we can lose the demonization. But we also have to do it with mutual respect, and that's certainly what we've seen in the constitution process. Everybody has respected each other's positions. Now, we're going to have some pretty intense horse trading, I suspect, when we come to the second draft. But I think that will hold, because I think people will respect each other and know that there are different points of view. And you've got a bit of an ideological spread too. You've got some people will take very strong positions. Good. I hope I can hold the jackets for long enough to get to the second stage, and then we'll see where we go. I've sort of left feeling about it. It's just a prize, that constitution in the end is a prize that's really, really worthwhile, striving for and putting in effort and thought into it. And, I really appreciate hearing how your own views over time have changed on that. And thanks for coming and talking to us here today. And and obviously I'll see you in the next of those. I hope you will be getting stuff after the local elections, and we'll take it on from there. It's running slower than I wanted, but then everything does. Yeah. But I think we've got a good thing that we can achieve here, and I think we can find a way to do it. So thank you for taking part in it. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. And the cat looks very comfortable there in the background. Well, I'm troubled by constitutionalism. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much, Mike.
Wasn't that interesting? I really enjoyed listening to that. And it's fascinating seeing how this process of gathering different groups together and gathering our thoughts and preparing for something that's going to take us right through, hopefully, beyond independence and into a final constitution. Yeah. And I mean, like I said in the interview, Pensioners for Independence got asked if they'd like to take part, and myself and the co-convener of Pensioners for India National Group, we're both in it, and it's fascinating. I mean, I did wonder when I was talking to Mike if I hadn't used the word boring a bit too much, because actually I really don't. I mean, boring isn't really the right word, but it's just very precise language, and it's going into detail, and I completely understand why it needs to be like that. But actually, on the whole, my experience of reading it through it and thinking about it was far from boring. Actually, it just starts you thinking about, well, what you and I have said on other occasions. Actually, Fiona, that it's exciting, isn't it? It's when by the time we've got the finished article. I don't mean the provisional one, but the final one. We'll have created the basis for Scotland going forward, and that's just great being able to know that you've added a little bit into that. Oh yeah, it's almost like being one of the signatories to the original Declaration of Arbroath, albeit less sealing wax involved and more computer. Yes, and I suspect you and I wouldn't have been allowed because wrong gender. Well, how times have changed, eh? But the other thing I found really interesting listening when you were talking was, having come from Arbroath and the history of it, and the 702 years, having walked through the Abbey, you made the very valid point that that's great. It's history. It's emotionally engaging and inspirational, but actually that's not a basis for what we need for a modern country going forward.
No, it's like I do really sympathise, and well, it's not just much sympathise. I mean, I do really connect myself, with, a little bit about what's in the Declaration of Arbroath, and there's a couple of other historical, historical documents, and I do think that a constitution maybe eventually can refer back to those. They can refer back to, particularly I think the one about from the Arbroath one, that the king's job is to look after the land and the people, and if he's not doing a good job, the people can get themselves another king. I mean, I'm paraphrasing there, but I think that's something like that you can refer back to in a constitution, because I'm sure there'll be something that we'd want to put in our modern constitution that echoes that, but it's not. Yes. You obviously wouldn't use the same form of words, and as Mike said, there's just so much that's not in those old documents. But yeah, maybe as a bit of a preamble, to the main one, because what we need is a modern constitution for a new nation.
And we've got that other interesting example of the Constitution for Iceland, where they left Denmark at the time of World War II took the Danish constitution and crossed out Denmark and put Iceland, more or less.
Yeah.
And then in 2011, I think it was, there was a huge grassroots input into coming up with an improved constitution, and it was probably our first glimpse at the power of social media for doing that kind of political engagement of your population. And we've got the clip actually of Catherine Oddsdottir talking to Leslie Riddick about that constitution. So let's just pause and have a little look at that now.
Yep.
And then we'll come back in a minute. It's only about 5 minutes long, but it's from the Nation Iceland film that Phantom Power and Leslie Riddick did.
The new Icelandic politics produced radical ways of thinking about how politics could be done, including revising the nation's very foundation of democracy, the constitution.
You were one of the people that put together the crowdsourced constitution, which has actually entrapped everybody, ensnared everybody's attention across the world for its boldness. What was the reason for needing to do that?
Well, Iceland became independent in 1944. Let's start by Big Bang. We are Big Bang. No, but sorry, I have to explain. Because after that, we decided, okay, Danes were occupied by the Nazis, so we're just going to sneak away, because we've been trying for ages to get away, and finally we had a moment there. So we were doing that, and we said, okay, let's just have the constitution from Denmark, change the word king with president, and run. So we just voted on the two things. Do we want to be independent? Secondly, do we want this to be the constitution? And everybody was in agreement that this should only be a preliminary constitution. However, now, 70 years later, we still have that old Danish crappy constitution, and we've always intended to write our own. It's part of being a real independent nation, in my opinion, to have your own social contract. So why would you be a society or a nation if you can't even agree upon your own foundational law? And then after the crash in Iceland in 2008, there was this amazing moment of clarity, where people finally were like, okay, so hang on, why are we doing this? Why do we have the law? Why do you have all the system? What we thought we had was completely not working, so now we have to make a new one. And then finally there was this enough sort of general support, especially from the power holders, to actually do this, well. So they decided, okay, we've been trying to do this for years without any success ourselves. Let's give it to the people. So they had this amazing National Assembly with 1,000 randomly selected people coming together for a whole day in a sports complex, just deciding upon the values of that new constitution. And then after that, and it was all streamed and online and so on, that was back in 2011. And after that, they had the elections where 25 people got elected, including myself. And we decided, after a little bit of a stubbly beginning, that we would try to be the change. So let's open it up. We're asking them to be transparent, our power holders. We're asking them to be accountable. Let's do that then ourselves. So we only had one IT guy, and we were doing this all on the run. We only had 4 months to write the thing. But we decided to, okay, let's just do this, let's do it and let everybody comment on it and see what we're doing as we do
Now,
it.
Son of Philosophy says ideas from the public should always be welcome, but much thought and effort ought to be required to make them politically viable.
How did you manage that?
We connected our website to Facebook. Every week we published a draft. So first time we published it was just the chapters, and people could comment through their Facebook account saying like, okay, why isn't this in front of this or whatever, And when we first published it online, we were really scared because the way people can talk online sometimes it's just foul, So we thought, okay, they're going to go like at us, and it's going to be one ugly mess, But that did not happen at all. And actually what happened was that the people, they sort of repaid the trust that we gave them with a lot of dignity in the conversation. So we got great ideas coming from the people through that site, and also people could just send us proposals. We also, of course, reached out a lot to the experts and, drew them in. But basically the openness of it was not only just to get more ideas and to make it sort of more wide, but also to create ownership, that we together would do this, It's about democracy in the whole. It's about if people should believe that we can actually deepen democracy as a concept, or if we should just forget about it. Because we're looking at the same trends everywhere, where people are losing trust in the representatives. They don't bother to show up. They feel they can't have any say in anything, and power is somewhere completely different than to where they're at. Nobody listens to them. This is so understandable. Why should I participate in a dance that isn't really about me or for me, or even, I don't even like the tune playing in the background, why should I? So we need to try to use examples like this in Iceland, where people have actually been able to participate and they've delivered something much greater than if they wouldn't have participated, and make it into reality to show that this is a viable path.
And what would you say at the moment are the odds of this actually happening?
The surveys show that the support is only rising. So you're not going to ignore this. There's no way that you can. I don't know if we will get it exactly the same way that we wrote it, but we will get it as the basis for a new constitution. I'm 100% sure.
So that was really interesting, wasn't it, to listen, to hear how they went about it.
And yet, it didn't, in the end, it didn't produce something that they've been able to get into, into law. And that's in a country with just 300,000 of a population. So on the one hand, you would think, well, you can get everyone involved with that small number, but it just shows that there are technicalities that you do have to take into account. Plus, you do need to involve your government and your representatives as well. A constitution it's for the citizens, and it's to protect citizens and protect the land, and it's to say what we're for and actually what we're not for. But a constitution is also something that helps a nation become accepted in the international community, in the United Nations, and it's something that actually gives other nations confidence that if they enter into an agreement with us or a treaty of some sort, that we've got the legal kind of standing, but also just the agreement of the population about how we deal with that, honourably, as it were. So, I'd like to think that in the years following Scotland becoming independent, that we will have, some sort of citizens' assembly set up, grassroots input, and that coming together with the people who know how to put that language in place and to do it in a way that will be acceptable, in constitutional affairs.
We found an article on why the Icelandic constitution hadn't quite managed to result in a new constitution for Iceland. And I think it was that point about the grassroots were enthusiastically owning this, and they didn't seem to bring their parliament and the government into it quickly enough, so that when it was then reached that stage, they didn't have the buy-in of the people they needed to take it forward. And I think that was what I was quite impressed with what Mike was saying, that the process he described is, I think, will avoid that pitfall. And he's the perfect person, really, to be leading it because of his background in the parliament.
Yeah, he is, absolutely. So to move on to the next little section, I mean, interesting. We've just been talking about grassroots involvement, and you and I just had a bit of it was really enjoyable out at Milngavie the other day, wasn't it? When we thought, well, let's ask some passers-by if they've thought about what sort of constitution Scotland might have, or even do they think that it'd be better if the UK had one? I really enjoyed doing that, and it's great when you get people to, once they get on a bit of a roll, and suddenly they're just there and they're telling you exactly what they think.
And it was very interesting, some of their responses. So we're going to play this now. It's a little compilation of the reaction that we got. Well, here we are on the streets of sunny Milngavie. It's a beautiful day. We're set up just by the Pensioners for Indy stall, which they have every second Friday. And we're just going to see if we can get some views from the people in the streets as to what they think about matters constitutional.
What do you think about the UK needing a written constitution?
It needs something dramatically changed, because it's broken. When you just look at this going on just now, the whole idea of the ministerial code and such like, it doesn't work. It's broken. There's nothing to stop the government, if it chooses, just to go on and do what it wants to do. So just for that itself, it's broken. It needs something. So hopefully we won't be part of the UK for much longer. We can worry about our own constitution.
As you're saying, there isn't any.
We don't have a constitution, and I believe if we get independence, we would have our own constitution in Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I totally agree with.
I think as well, when you look at the example that we're getting from down the road right now, that more than anything says why we need a constitution, to protect us from that kind of rogue government. You need something that sits above it.
An unwritten constitution is not a constitution at all.
No, it's whatever they say it is.
That's what everyone goes about. Well, Parliament is sovereign. Actually, what that means is it's just folk with the biggest number of MPs that gets to decide it.
And historically, they would argue maybe it's worked okay, because governments and ministers have, at least on the surface, appeared to have an element of integrity. But that's broken, that's gone. It's gone. And once it's gone, how that's recovered, I don't know.
At the moment, I mean, what's happened, shenanigans that have happened down in Westminster?
Oh, it's shocking. How that man, he's a mirror image of Donald Trump, isn't he? That's all he's doing.
Yeah.
He's exactly the same as Donald Trump. It's a disgrace. The other thing is a disgrace is the fact that his own government MPs sit and simply do doddies with him. Accept everything he's doing.
And because there's not a written constitution, there's no document, you can't do it. You can't appeal to something. What do you think about what Scotland will need in terms of constitution?
I know there's been some work being done to get something down black and white, and I think that's important. And I think to get as many people and groups and different interest groups involved, whether it's trade unions and pensioners groups and workers and businesses, to make sure that there's a whole buy-in to it, and not just politicians sitting and putting that together.
And a constitution. It's an interesting thing here, because Scotland since the 50s, the early 60s, has become, and they use the word socialist, a socially minded country. Right. Not necessarily fully socialist, but
Social democratic.
I believe we would need a constitution that recognised full democracy and the opportunities for a socially improved country.
What would you put in it?
What would you put in it?
I'll come round, Jake.
Constitution.
Well, so far
Some kind of lasting commitment to independence.
Well, that would be a good start. You're not even going to get the chance to do it unless we've got that far. Because I'd like to see something in it about land reform and having discussions on how
And foreign owners that
Yes.
about the land,
Yeah.
that includes that. Oh, I'd be up for that. Give them small compensation and invite them to stay if they'd like to pay rent on it. But,
It's our utilities as well, though, and ports and everything. We own nothing.
well, we've got all the natural resources are here. If we get the opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, the wind farms, whether or not you like these turbines or not, it's cheap electricity. If you get them offshore, you don't listen to Donald Trump, who actually stands on the beach and worries about something 2 miles out there. In fact, some of them look quite, smaller sun hills, and you look at these things, they actually look quite nice to me. So I've no problem with that. Wind, wave, we've got all the energy offshore.
Well, right, that leaflet that you've got in your hand is sort of the main
whether or not you agree with it, nuclear energy is relatively green. You know, I don't think we would need it in this country. And the other thing, of course, not with nuclear, the first thing I would do is get rid of that abomination down at Vaseline.
I think we need to commit ourselves to something more internationalist.
And not just yes voters either. It's
Can't just be people who supported it. It's got to include everybody if it's going to work.
Whatever it is, it should be in it. It should be well underway under discussion now, and it has been kind of left to the other side.
It was a big omission for 2014.
It was.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Fantastic opportunity, though. Make it the way you want it.
I mean, plenty of people have done it, so
absolutely, yeah.
hopefully learn from a lot of those places and do a good job of it. It certainly can't be any worse than what's going on. Just
really can't, can it?
So the sooner the better. Hopefully we'll hear some news soon.
The difficulty with writing that constitution.
Well, there's plenty of countries around the world have written their own constitutions.
And it's still
leaving the British Empire.
There was a comment on within the last 48 hours I saw on the television. Oh yeah, in fact, you know what? It was about the programme was about colonialism.
All right, well that's it.
It was about, and they mentioned that none of these countries have ever asked to go back. And I thought, would Scotland ever ask to go back? We've discussed things like that. It's taking over transport and necessarily nationalising it to make it a better infrastructure. The government can do that.
Well, I mean, there's one way of thinking about constitutions that they're constitutions for the common good. Things like, okay, so obviously, you know, we've got a lot of water around the country and there's fish stocks in it and that's what the food source. But the idea is that basically the fish belong to the nation. And yes, we need fishermen to go out and get them, but all the money from that doesn't go into the
That's exactly the guy gets this privatised office.
I suspect that, Mike. Is that your wife?
That's my wife.
Sorry,
we got him talking.
All right, they're all day. Great talking to you.
Thanks very much.
That next month we're going to carry on this subject, and we've got an interview with Dr. Elliot Bulmer coming up. So here's a little taster of what you can see next month in this show.
I want to demystify constitutions and just explain them that, you know, constitutions are about as interesting as the plumbing in your house. You want it to be there, you want it to work, you probably don't want to have to take too much of an interest in it until it starts to stink. And when there's a problem, when constitutions are broken, when they don't work, when they don't provide a sound agreed basis for mutual cooperation and for holding governments to account and for including people in the political discussion, that's when people start to notice them, right? So in a British context, we're having a lot of conversation now about the inadequacy of Britain's very unique kind of unwritten constitution. I might even call it a sort of non-existent constitution, a we pretendy constitution, if you want to use those terms, because it doesn't perform some of the key functions that a constitution normally performs. So most countries have a thing called a constitution. It looks like, I don't actually have one to hand because all my books are in storage in Dundee somewhere, but they're not telephone books. They're thin little things that you can put in your pocket normally, and they set out the ground rules of the state. And most countries have them. I think we tend to think, when we think of constitutions, people think about America. You hear about the American Constitution on TV, but America is actually an outlier, right? America has a very odd constitution, a very old constitution. If you're looking at a constitution today, you wouldn't look at America as your example. You'd look at perhaps other Commonwealth countries. countries like Australia, Jamaica, Barbados, etc., that have had a similar parliamentary system of government, but have written it down in ways that clarify it and protect it. You'd look at other European countries. So you'd look at places like Sweden, Norway, Ireland. And so this comes back to your first question. When you start with a blank piece of paper, what do you do? Well, you almost never start with a blank piece of paper.
Right, the second interview is Dr. Elliot Bulmer, who is a constitutional, he called himself advisor, but I think expert is probably closer to the mark. He's also an author, has done a couple of books, one called Constituting Scotland and one called
Constitution for the Common Good.
That's, thank you, which I've ordered. Everybody who comes on our show as a guest, if they have a book, we buy it. So yes, he's taking a much kind of higher level view of what constitutions are for across the world, and he gives us some really interesting examples of, you know, how they come about. And the other thing that I thought was very interesting, we forget how many people, how many countries have left what was the British Empire, and they've all left pretty much with constitutions. They've set them in place, and that's what's helped their independent democracy thrive.
Yes. And then interesting, wasn't it? Because you said often what happened was that a country like Jamaica leaves the British Empire, becomes independent within the Commonwealth, and its constitution initially was just, in a way, it mirrors the kind of institutes that already have, which are, things being the way they were British institutes. And then that's its starting off point.
Yeah.
And then they take it from there and make it their own. But of course Scotland won't be able to do that because, there isn't a British constitution, and that in itself is quite a thing to take on board.
That is about what do we want to be as a country, what kind of country do we want to be, and what are our values, what do we stand for?
And I mean, it's important to say, isn't it, that it's not just going to be one section of the the citizenship of Scotland who will be writing and then making this happen. This has got to be a document that everyone can get themselves behind, and no doubt there'll be some some things that people might want in, some people might want in it that others won't, and so we've got to have a big discussion. We've got to have a big national discussion about that, and that's going to take time to do.
Yeah, we will have a podcast version of both of these as well on our podcast website, and wherever you get your podcasts, you'll get us. Scottish Independence Podcast will also get us. So thanks for watching, and now we better get back to pounding the streets in sunny Milngavie.
So let's go back. Bye.